Good morning, everyone. This is Doug. This is an episode entitled, Did Jesus Prophesy of Paul as Least in Matthew 5, verse 19? I'm rebooting this video from several years ago because I think it's been enough time that I probably need to review it for those couple thousand that have not seen it because you have not been a subscriber until the last year. So let's take a look at this. Matthew 5, verse 19, Young's Literal. Whoever, therefore, may loose or relax one of these commands, meaning the law Jesus referred to in the prior verses, the least, meaning the least of the commands, and may teach men so, least he shall be called by the reign of the kingdom of heavens, by the people who are in the kingdom of heavens. But whoever may do and may teach them, he shall be called great in the reign of the heavens. I will explain why the en there means by in a moment. We're going to do it right here. So what do we have? We have a problem here, which is the word en would suggest this least person is saved, but the exact opposite is the intention. So whoever is called least here is not a saved individual, but is condemnable because they're teaching against God's law. So let's read it in context. Therefore, whoever relaxes, there's the correct meaning of Leo, one of the least, elikistos, of these commandments, and teaches others to do the same, will be called least, elikistos, by the kingdom of heaven, not in the kingdom of heaven, because it's not suggesting that he's in the kingdom. It's the kingdom of God is going to call him least because he's teaching against, relaxing, undoing the commandments of God. But whoever does them and teaches others, this person will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. So that antithesis between least and great is how we know that this is a negative over here. So the word by is the correct translation. And if you didn't know it, the word en, even though it does transpose it directly into English as in, it has a wider sense of meaning in Greek, and it does mean by. Let me show you that here. So I asked AI, can you give me the answer on this? Yes, the Greek preposition en can indeed be translated as by in English, especially when referring to the cause or agent of an action. So the agent of this action is the kingdom of heaven. So it's by this kingdom of heaven, they're going to call this person who teaches you to relax the law, to not observe the law correctly, is basically not going to be in heaven. So therefore, it's the kingdom of heaven who will call him least. So it will be called by them, he's least, but it doesn't or shouldn't imply in any sense of the word he's in the kingdom of heaven. So once he gets in the kingdom of heaven, we'll call him least. So that's the incorrectness of using the word in there. So anyway, even if you had in there, you could still read it correctly in your head. It's just better and more clear to say it's called least by the kingdom of heaven. All right, so now what does Jesus say in Matthew 5, 17, and 18 that leads up to verse 19? So let's get a wider context. Jesus says, do not suppose that I came to throw down the law or the prophets. I did not come to throw down, but to perform perfectly, to fulfill. For verily I say to you, till that the heaven and earth may pass away, one iota or one tittle may not pass away from the law, till that all may come to pass. So what is Jesus talking about, the heavens and earth being passed away? Well, God actually says in Isaiah 11, I'm going to bring one day new heavens and new earth. So Jesus is saying, until that happens, not one iota or not one tittle, that's little marks of the pen, stroke of a pen for the iota and the tittle. Those are very small marks. And he's saying not even the smallest mark will be removed from the law and the prophets until that day comes, until the heavens and earth pass away. And it won't happen. The law will not be changed until the heavens and earth pass away. So when you have a new heavens and new earth, you will have some new principles, and that's particularly in Isaiah 11 is the lamb will lie down next to the wolf, and there'll be no more harm anymore on my holy mountain. So no more animal sacrifices. You can have sacrifices of grain. So these are things that if you read carefully Isaiah 11 and 56, you'd see these kind of issues. Anyway, but the point is Jesus saying no, until the heavens and earth pass away, not even one jot or tittle will go away from the law. So anybody who claims that the law was given by angels and who are weak and beggarly and no gods and things like that, which are in Galatians, if you didn't know, that person can't possibly understand what Jesus is talking about. He doesn't know about this passage. And just so you know, Paul claims in Galatians 2 that the 12 imparted nothing to me. The pillars of the church, they don't matter anything to me. God does not care about the status of human beings. So this is what Paul claims. And therefore, he doesn't want to know and doesn't care to know anything they say because, of course, he's getting all his messages from his Jesus in the third heaven. But I digress. So let's keep going. All right, so let's look a little more in depth at Matthew 5:19. So in Greek, the word for least is elikistos, okay? What if we had to imagine what would be a Latin name? So let's say someone had Latin citizenship, Roman citizenship from birth. What would have been on their birth certificate? What was their name? Well, what if their name was Poxolilus? Okay. Now, that is a word that means least. Okay. But typically it would be contracted to the word Paulus, Paulus. And in Greek, you would turn Poxolilus, Paulus, into Paulos. See there? It would be transliterated into Greek as Paulos. So the U in Greek, excuse me, in Latin will become an O in Greek. And in our New Testament, his name is Paulos, but it's actually known to be a Latin name. Now, let me show you where this is a well recognized fact. For example, take a look at Jameson Fausset Brown's commentary, page 556 out of 9,991 pages. Thank goodness we have search ability in Adobe Acrobat, and that's how I got this page. And so here it is. So, he matter of factly mentions the name Paulus in Latin means least. It's not a secret. So, Paul's name means least. And this is a screenshot of this page. So how did anyone ever figure out that Paul's name was Paulus in terms of that was be a contraction, that the contraction was formed from the word Poxolilus, which means least? How did anyone ever deduce that? Well, let's look at 1 Corinthians 15:9. Augustine, a Latin speaker, looked at this, and even though it said in Greek elikistos, he could see what it meant in Latin. So let me just read you what it says. For Paul says, "For I am the least of the apostles, and do not even deserve to be called an apostle, an elikistos apostle." That's what he's saying. So 1 Corinthians 15:9 signal to Augustine something clear to him because he's a Latin speaker, that Paul's name Paulus means Poxolilus, and that means least. Let's take a look. This was discovered by Farrar in 1889. He spotted Augustine's mention of the Latin contraction Paulus meant least, aka Poxolilus from Paucus. Okay, so here is the whole thing. If you want to look it up, it's F.W. Farrar, The Life and Work of St. Paul, and that will give you at page 200, footnote 2. Here's the face page of it, and you can see clearly there is a message of what he's reading in Augustine. And what Augustine has to do is he can't use the word Poxolilus to define Poxolilus, so he uses a synonym, minimus. So he says Poxolus means minimum, the least, apostolorum. So he's the least of the apostles. So that's what it says in Latin for that verse. And then he says that means his name was Poxolilus. And then Farrar said that's what he deduced is the message of Augustine. So that's why we know that it's recognizable. If you were a Latin speaker and Latin reader, you would know who and what Paul's real name was, what it really meant in Latin, and it meant least. But we don't have to leave it in the hands of Augustine alone. We need to look it up in dictionaries. And so 2 centuries before Farrar even noticed that, the Holyoke Latin Dictionary stated without any mention of Paul that Poxolilus means least. So here's Poxolilus, a double diminutive of the word paucus. So paucus means few or small. If you want to say it's smaller or lesser, you would say Poxolus, and that's a single diminutive. And then if you want to make it least or smallest, you have to use the word Poxolilus, and that would give you the meaning, the double diminutive form of the word, which would be the extreme of the word. So here it's saying this is an adjective that is taken from the word Poxolus, and then made an extra diminutive. So it's an actual level of diminutive meaning. And it says right here, the least that can be. Okay, so Poxolus means the least that could be. Now let's keep studying a little bit. 24 years later, in 1704, Martinius, in his Latin dictionary, explained that Poxolilus contracts into Paulus, Paul's name. So you see right here, Paulus is the name or the subject name, the target name we're looking at, and what can it be? You can have it to be taken from the word Poxolus or Poxolilus, but Paul knows his name. Which one was it? Was he smaller or was he smallest? Was he lesser or least? And he knew he was least, and that's why he was playing on the meaning of his name in 1 Corinthians. and that's why Augustine could recognize what he was doing and which contraction the form of his name came from originally. So Augustine deduced it was Poxolilis, least. Very interesting, amazing statement. Then down here you see this was actually recognized by Martinius in 1701 that Paulus is the same as we know as Saulus, the apostle to the Gentiles. He said that right there. So he's very aware what that who this refers to, and we don't know exactly how he figured that out, but he obviously must have done the same thing that Farrar did. He refers clearly to this person as being Saulus, who comes from the tribe of Benjamin. So there is no doubt he connected the dots. So the actual first person to connect the dots, honestly, was before Farrar, was this gentleman, Matthias Martinius. So there's no dispute. Paul's name was Poxolilis. Now, for those of you who want to do more in-depth research, I'm going to provide a link in the description that will give you this list of 2 books that I've collected on this topic. The Holyoke book I just demonstrated, and you can download the PDF. And also you can download Martinius's lexicon from 1701 from the same link, and just click the PDF and it'll download to your computer. Who else agrees with the conclusion that Paul's name is the least? And that would include not only Jameson, Fuss, and Brown, which I also showed you, but Farrar, as I also showed you, of course. But also Bultmann seems to agree. Bultmann acknowledged that Matthew 5, verse 19, with its reference to least for the law-loosening teacher, is a reference, quote, perhaps to Paul himself. Rudolf Bultmann, Theology of the New Testament. And that would be at page 54 of his book. David Hill in the Gospel of Matthew, Grand Rapids Erdman's 1981 notes, quote, many have found in this verse, Matthew 5, verse 17, an attack on the work and teaching of Paul. See page 119. And, quote, it is claimed the term least is a reference to Paul, close quote. Similarly, Bromley's Encyclopedia and the International Bible Encyclopedia, Erdman's 1995, mentions some make the, quote, argument that the warning in Matthew 5:19 about the man who relaxes one of these least commandments and teaches men so is a covert attack by stricter Jewish Christians on Paul, page 823. Can we just say Matthew? Are we casting doubt now on Matthew that it's from Matthew? That appears to be the solution of Bromley's Encyclopedia, mainstream as it comes, Erdsman's. See, ladies and gentlemen, how desperate they get when they can't face reality. They don't like the reality they have to face, but it's right there. It's in front of your own eyes. You can't unsee it once you have seen it. And if you try to isolate this passage as the only one that is anti-Paul, well, D.C. Sim puts a crush to that notion in his article, Matthew's Anti-Paulinism, a Neglected Feature of Matthean Studies, 2002 at 767. And he mentions Matthew 5:19 among several anti-Paul statements in Matthew. So this is not the only thing that's problematical for Paul, is Matthew 5:19. But anyway, is that going to be your solution? You're just going to say, well, Matthew didn't write it because it's against Paul? No, you have to take this into account in your analysis of whether you should be following and listening to Paul. Because if Jesus clearly is giving the message condemning Paul, then you need to not follow him, not follow Paul, right? So this is not a thing you just blithely assume. It can't be true that Jesus would criticize Paul. That's not the right solution. The right solution is Paul's claims to have met Jesus on the road to Damascus, which he can't prove from any reliable sources who were there present because he doesn't quote their names. He doesn't give you the names of the 2 multiple men who were with him. They're undescribed. He makes up a story about a guy named Ananias who said he had a dream 2 weeks earlier where this is what was going to happen. But nobody ever heard from Ananias ever again, and that no one heard of Ananias before the 2-week period prophesying, hey, something big is going to happen in 2 weeks. So all the events that you expect to happen if this was a real story or reliable facts is you would have a lot more facts. You don't. So now you weigh it against what Jesus says, and you should come away with the decision that I'm going to follow Jesus. What's the harm in that? Now, let me digress a little bit here. I was convinced about this issue because I know that Matthew doesn't know Greek. It's ridiculous. He lives in the backwater. The only administrative language at the time would have been Aramaic. So it would be you would know Hebrew and Aramaic. You wouldn't know Greek. That language was dead and gone out of that culture unless you went to the theater at Jerusalem and watched plays. That was the Herodian compound. So they had Greek activities there. But the people in Galilee are far, far away, and they live in a backwater. They don't know Greek. They basically don't have any superior education over just regular people, craftsmen, workmen, and that's it. And they're fishermen. So this is not a culture that knows anything about Greek. So therefore, there's no way that in reading the word in Hebrew for least, and that's what Matthew first wrote in by multiple sources, that he would have any clue that that word least would connect up with the word olikistos, and that that would trigger Augustine to go, what is it? Why is he calling himself least? Oh, well, Paulus is the word in Latin that contracts from Poctolus, which means least. Oh, so I mean, that whole long string of logical steps to get to this position is so far removed from what a backwater Matthew dealing with Hebrew only and some Aramaic, he would never even imagine what Paul's Latin name would be. Even if he could know his name was Paulus, who would know such a thing? And would you know that it's the contraction from, is it Pauxilus, which means lesser or smaller, or would it be from Pauxilolus, which means least or smallest, right? So there's no way that anybody would know this except by divine knowledge. And that's why I am convinced this is actually truly a message from Jesus. So let's take a look at this. But Paul's name, meaning least, also explains a few things. Why Jesus identified three traits of this false messenger. He was a law loosener, means he's apostate. He's teaching people away from God's law, who was called by those in the kingdom. So he's not in the kingdom, but he's called something by those in the kingdom. And he's called what? The least. See? So this is a progression of three facts that are all come out of what Jesus is saying. Now, why does this have any importance? Because Christians who are resurrected to heaven will call the one who taught the loosening of the law by the name of Pauxilus, or for short, Paulus, whom they correctly did not follow. So, when we, God willing, you make it to heaven, okay, or the new millennium kingdom, God willing, you're going to be there. You're going to find out for a fact that Paul's name is what he was called backwards, meaning they're going to call somebody called least, but he ain't going to be there because he can't. He's an apostate. Apostates are subject to death penalties, and Paul went way beyond violating the Deuteronomy 13, 1-10 apostasy provisions, okay, in 2 Corinthians and Romans and Ephesians and Colossians and most of all in Galatians, which is his second major epistle after 1 Corinthians. But I digress. All right, now to figure out the meaning of the whole passage, 519, is important to take a look at 520. So what's the consequence of those people who reject the least one? Is it a bad thing? They're going to hell? They should have recognized the least one, the Paulus one, was the good guy? Or were they correct to reject this person? Let's read what Jesus says, and this is a synopsis of 5, verse 20. Those who teach opposite of the law loosener, the least, Jesus says, will be called great in the reign of the heavens. Not even worse than the bad least guy. No, they're the great. They're going to be called great in the kingdom of heaven. The law loosener is not in heaven. Rather, in the Greek, as the Young's Literal shows, those in the kingdom of heaven call the law loosener the least, and in Greek means also by. So the least is called by those in the kingdom of heaven least, which implies that the least one isn't there, because they're looking back at him and saying, ha ha, there's the guy who told us not to follow the law, and his name is going to be called least, or Paulus in Latin. Next, the law negator will be called least by those in the kingdom of heaven. The next verse 520, this is important. This is what closes the deal. It says the listener's righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees. We'll get into what that might mean, to enter the kingdom of heaven. So the Pharisees' level of holiness, you got to study what this is, because Paul has a totally incorrect view of the righteousness of the Pharisees. They're law looseners themselves. You'll see in a second. Jesus condemns them for that multiple times. Let's see what I say here. Jesus always depicts the Pharisees as guilty of negation of God's law by their man-made traditions. Paul comes along years later and claims the Pharisees rigidly keep the law at 100% total odds with Jesus. Let's take a look at that. So sometimes it's useful to just ask AI a question. And it says right here, Jesus criticizes the Pharisees for making the law of God of none effect, that's a quotation, through their traditions in Mark 7, verse 13. He says, quote, you skillfully sidestep God's law in order to hold on to your own tradition. So all the doctrines you get from Paul are his traditions, because he doesn't quote the law and he negates the law. So he skillfully sidesteps them. And he's following the same tradition of the Pharisees. But that's to him, that's being rigid. The Pharisees are rigid according to the law. They follow the law rigidly. Let's just take a look here at Mark 7:13. I want to read it in Mountsy. Thus you invalidate the word of God, logos hotheos, with your tradition that you have handed down, and you do many similar things. So Jesus is very clear that they do away with God's law by tradition. That's apostasy, my friends. It's just no way, two ways that you could describe it. Turning people away from following God's law by giving them a tradition that replaces God's law with something totally different is a doctrine of basically an apostate. Now, Jesus says the Pharisees are guilty of apostasy in detail when they do away with the command of God. In Matthew 15, we'll read that here. Okay, this is the King James Version. I'm reading it there, and you'll find it fascinating. Then came to Jesus scribes and Pharisees. Now remember, Paul says, I am a Pharisee, so he should know better than anyone. They're little looseners. But Paul, by the way, again, I have to repeat, he says in Galatians 2, the 12, the pillars in particular, imparted nothing to me because I get all my revelations from the third heaven from my Jesus. So he doesn't want to know anything about Jesus. Well, he's being blindsided here because he doesn't know what Jesus really exposed about the Pharisees, which is they are apostates in large part. Okay, they may teach some parts of the law, but in general, they're very bad. And this is a perfect example. You'll see. Why do they ask, the Pharisees and the scribes ask, why do your disciples transgress the tradition of the elders? For they wash not their hands when they eat bread. But Jesus answered and said unto them, why do you also transgress the commandment of God by your tradition? So transgress means break. Why do you break God's commandment by a tradition? And then he's going to give them a proof text of what they're doing. And it's about the commandment to honor your mother and father. And before I read this, let me give you context. Is they had created a rule called the Korban. And it meant if you gave a gift to the temple under the auspices of the Pharisees, they would give you a promise that we'll take care of mom and dad in old age. Now, why is that important? Because when it says honor your father and mother, we may not realize it, but the words there connote or imply that if your mother and father were fall into shame and dishonor and have to beg for food and you're living a nice life in town, you can't do that. You have to honor your mother and father by taking them into your home and making them live comfortably with you. So that's what honoring your mother and father in practical terms required because of the wording of the text. It's about not allowing dishonor to happen to your mother and father in particular. So you're going to see that now. Verse 4, for God commands, saying, honor your father and mother, and he that curses father and mother, let him die the death. So dishonoring your mother and father is not a minor thing. Your parents, by the way, could disown you if you curse them, so you wouldn't have to be killed. And that was so you would lose your inheritance if you did that. So you shouldn't curse your mother and father. That's just how that worked out. Verse 5, but you say, whosoever shall say to his father or his mother, it is a gift, Korban, by whatsoever thou mightest been profited by me. In other words, what you might otherwise have gotten from me, which is that care and uptake in my house. No, I gave it ahead of time, way ahead of time as a Korban payment. I even have a piece of paper that says I'm excused from having to take care of you if you become a beggar. Verse 6, and honor not your father and mother, he shall be free. So the son or daughter is told, you don't have to take care of mom and dad if you have paid this Korban to the Pharisees. Thus have you made the commandment of God, Jesus says, this is the fourth commandment, honor your father and mother, of none effect by your tradition. So they made up new rules by their tradition. You hypocrites, well did Isaiah prophesy of you, saying, this people, now watch what he's saying about people who teach you that God's law has been done away with by some guy from Tarsus. He could just make commands, whole new commandments that you could just follow. This people draws nigh unto me, near to me, with their mouth, and honors me with their lips. That's what happens every Sunday, I think. But their heart is far from me. And unless you have any kind of knowledge and love of God and about what he commands, you don't really have any connection to him. And so his commandments are part of what he aspires you to be showing and proving your love to him by obeying them. Then this is the key, the kicker, the apostasy language. But in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. So when you teach Paul's doctrines, commandments of men, in place of God's commandments, what do you think God thinks of you? You're an apostate. You're just a party to the same level of death penalty offense that would send you to hell. So don't take this as a warning you shouldn't take seriously. And even if you didn't even know what this passage says, this is independently verifiable that whatever Paul is saying in those passages I read to you earlier or referred to, Galatians, for example, God did not give the law. It was given by angels, according to Paul, who are no gods, and they're weak and beggarly angels. And why do you want to be in bondage again to the weak and beggarly angels by observing Sabbath? And it's such a crime that he should say that, because in Isaiah 56:67, God says something that Jesus then quotes in his throwing out the money changers. Remember at the temple? He says, this will be a house of prayer for all nations. Well, if you read just one verse before that, it says, God says, I invite the Gentiles, the sojourners who want to attach themselves to me, Yahweh says, who observe and do not defile the Sabbath, meaning you don't work on Sabbath. That's condition number one. I'm going to welcome you, my holy mountain. That's the temple of the New Jerusalem, is what that's referring to in Isaiah 56. And then it goes on to say, and who hold fast to the covenant. And that means the Ark of the Covenant, the 2 tablets of stone, meaning the 10 commandments in a box called the Ark of the Covenant, and shortened phrase is the covenant. So that's what Isaiah said, and that's what Jesus quoted from. But Paul doesn't seem to know anything about what Jesus is teaching, because he says they 12 imparted nothing to me, and I didn't need to get anything from them. I was going all the time to the Jesus of the third heaven talking to me. But that's another thing. So you see, Paul is twisting God's word constantly and distorting it and minimizing it and changing it. And Jesus saying, you Christians who do allowed him to do that, you're following people who allow you to make a new tradition in place of the commandments of God. Now, I just want to tell you something about the Pharisees. I wrote an article just on the Pharisees, or chapter, I should say, in my book, Jesus Words Only. It's chapter 9. It's online and you can get it for free. All right. So now to understand Matthew 5:20, which is your righteousness must exceed that of the Pharisees, we have to understand the Pharisees have a very low level of righteousness, because they very much negate God's law. So let's listen to this. Jesus taught the Pharisees suffered from shallow teaching on the law, Matthew 23:23. So this is another passage, not the one we just referred to in Matthew 5, but the different one in chapter 23. They taught, quote, the less weighty matter of tithing. So, by the way, if you pay attention to Pauline Christian churches, they do teach you to tithe. That's the only law they'll tell you to follow. But other than that, no, the law is dead and gone. So the Pharisees the same. Pharisees teach the less weightier matter of tithing, which, by the way, is only on rich people, basically, people who have land, who have farm and animals. It was never on cash and currency or day labor work, which is very common in that time period. So there was no tax at all. So people talk about no tax on tips. Well, there was no tax on wages. And that was just flat reading of the law. And the tithing only applied to people who have crops, people who's had a 10th animal born on a farm in a single year. That's pretty large herd of cows, let's say. So you have nine cows born on the farm that year, but not 10. So you get to keep the 9. No tithing of the 10th animal, because there was no 10th animal. So you see how God selected people who are more wealthy to pay more, and let the regular people, the day laborers, go tax free. You see the benefit. And there was no taxes under God's system before they had kings. And that started with King Saul, but that's another question. So the Pharisees, taught the less weightier matters of tithing to the neglect of the weightier matters of the law. The Pharisees replaced written commandments from the law given Moses with oral tradition that, quote, makes of none effect the written law. That was in Matthew 15:6. They did away with the commandment to honor your mother and father by replacing it with a piece of paper that you get for a sum of money that the Pharisees determined how much it would be. And it wouldn't be necessarily enough to take care of mom and dad. And maybe the mom and dad have to beg the Pharisees to give them some money way years in the future. And maybe the money isn't around anymore. So this is just simply not responsible. And it's why Jesus is saying you have to follow the law of God, not the commandments of men. Mom and dad shouldn't be in that kind of stressful position. So now let's read further about the Pharisees in chapter 9. This is the heading: Zeal knowing no bounds to mislabel Pharisees as legalists. So this is a big agenda of Pauline Christianity to mislead you. If you're a Pauline Christian, you're being misled. I'm going to show you. With a vigor almost knowing no bounds, the cheap grace gospel has altered our perception of what Jesus condemned about the Pharisees. The Pharisees are constantly portrayed as, quote, strict legalists. You've heard that, my friends. Hopkins, 444, Steele, page 87, Shane, 857. These are works that were footnoted in the index to this book, Jesus Words Only. This charge of legalism is the claim that the Pharisees taught every jot and tittle of the law, and that they thought one could be right with God by acting obedient to the law. The cheap grace gospel adherents desire us to think that Jesus supposedly wanted us to know only faith was necessary to be right with God, and that the Pharisees' error was supposedly they rejected faith alone, wrongly relying instead on obeying all the law. A preposterous position that the Pharisees believed in all the law. We just saw Jesus condemned them for being apostates, essentially. The same thing that Paul was doing in his lessons, his teachings. Indeed, he claimed he was a Pharisee. Well, he was right in line with their teaching, and he never changed. So let's go to our conclusion now. For believers who follow Jesus, this passage of Matthew 5:17-19 is not a statement inserted to Matthew by a disgruntled legalist, follower of Jesus, Yeshua. Instead, Matthew 5, verse 19 is the living word of Jesus, Yeshua himself, which was deliberately hard to see at first, so would survive to speak to a much later time and not be erased. I mean, it's a miracle it's still there, right? Pauline Christianity didn't see what it was talking about because they didn't know Paul's name and they didn't understand what it meant in Latin because they were really predominantly Greek speakers. That's why the Gospels were all in Greek. They did not know the Latin meaning of the word. See, so they were caught off guard, and that's why it was able to survive all these centuries, 2 millennia. Jesus, Yeshua, intended for those who have ears to hear to have to think hard, just like when he spoke in parables to unlock the meaning and truth of this particular prophecy. So the conclusion leads us to the warning of Jesus. Jesus, Yeshua, prophesied about Paul in Matthew 5, verse 19, telling us of a coming law loosener whose name would mean least. As indeed Paxillus means, that's the long form of the contracted word for Paul. It in fact means least. Our duty now is to trust Yeshua, Jesus, as the sole teacher, as he claims in Matthew 23, verse 8-10. So he says also the apostle cannot be greater than the master. That's in John 13:16. So we have inverted the relationship between Jesus and Paul, claiming he is an apostle who can be superior to Jesus, and that's impossible if you knew the text of John 13:16, that it says in there in the Greek, no apostle is greater than the one who sent him. So anyway, God bless. I hope this helps you. Ciao.